Most people think an awakened empath becomes softer, kinder, more forgiving. That's the lie weak people depend on. Because the moment an empath truly awakens, they stop bleeding emotion for people who manipulate them. They stop explaining themselves, stop chasing connection. And suddenly, the people who once controlled them realize something terrifying: emotional access to that empath is gone forever. Awakened empaths stop seeking validation the moment they realize approval was never love, it was control disguised as acceptance. Most people never notice this because they've spent their entire lives being trained to perform emotionally for others. Smile the right way. Respond the right way. Stay agreeable. Stay available. Stay emotionally useful. And the terrifying part is that society rewards this behavior so consistently that people confuse external approval with personal value. But the awakened empath begins to see a pattern most people miss. They notice how quickly attention disappears when they stop overgiving, how certain people become uncomfortable the moment they stop explaining themselves, how relationships suddenly shift when they no longer apologize for having boundaries. That's when the deeper truth reveals itself. Many people were never attached to the empath, they were attached to the emotional access they had to them. This changes the empath psychologically. They stop reacting instantly to tension. Stop chasing reassurance after conflict. Stop measuring their worth through responses, text messages, compliments, or emotional approval from people who secretly benefit from their insecurity. And something strange begins to happen. Their silence becomes heavier. Their presence becomes calmer. People start watching them more carefully because emotionally independent people create uncertainty in others. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable around someone who cannot be emotionally controlled through praise or rejection. That's why manipulators often panic when an empath awakens. The old tactics stop working. Guilt loses power. Withdrawal loses power. Even criticism loses power. Because once someone no longer needs validation to feel whole, emotional leverage disappears completely. You can see this shift clearly in real life. The awakened empath no longer rushes to defend themselves when misunderstood. They no longer beg to be chosen in relationships where respect is inconsistent. They observe more than they speak. They notice who only becomes kind when they fear losing influence. They recognize how people often test boundaries indirectly through sarcasm, delayed responses, emotional withdrawal, or subtle disrespect just to see who still seeks approval badly enough to tolerate it. And most importantly, the awakened empath realizes valid. Addiction is one of the most invisible forms of psychological captivity in modern human behavior. Because the person desperate to be liked will almost always betray themselves to keep connection alive. But once that need dies, something dangerous is born in its place: emotional clarity. And people who once benefited from the empath's self-doubt can feel that change immediately, even when nothing is said out loud. Because the moment an empath stops needing permission to value themselves, the people who controlled them begin losing power they thought would last forever. Most people think silence means weakness, discomfort, or a lack of confidence. That misunderstanding alone is why silence becomes such a dangerous weapon in the hands of an awakened empath. Because while everyone else rushes to fill empty space with explanations, emotional reactions, nervous laughter, or defensive words, the awakened empath learns something most people never discover. Human beings reveal themselves fastest when they are not interrupted. Silence creates pressure, and under pressure people expose their true nature. The manipulator starts over-explaining. The liar adds unnecessary detail. The ends. The secure person begins fishing for reassurance. The dominant personality becomes irritated because they can no longer control the emotional rhythm of the interaction. Silence forces people to sit inside their own psychological discomfort, and very few people can tolerate that for long. This is why emotionally intelligent people speak less over time. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they understand that observation is power. They stop reacting instantly to accusations. Stop defending every misunderstanding. Stop emotionally volunteering information just to make other people comfortable. And the moment they stop doing this, something fascinating happens. People begin revealing intentions without realizing it. You can watch it happen in real life. Someone sends a passive-aggressive message expecting an emotional response. The awakened empath doesn't react. Hours later, the person sends another message trying a different emotional angle. Suddenly, the mask slips. The desperation becomes visible. Because silence interrupts manipulation patterns, it removes the emotional reward manipulative people depend on. Most people don't understand how much control they surrender through. Unnecessary speech. Every emotional reaction gives information away. Tone, pacing, defensiveness, urgency, all of it exposes psychological position. But silence hides position. It forces the other person to guess, and uncertainty creates tension. That tension is psychologically unbearable for people who rely on emotional control. This is why some individuals become strangely uncomfortable around calm people. Calmness removes predictability, and people lose influence the moment they can no longer predict your emotional reactions. The awakened empath eventually realizes that silence is not the absence of power, it is controlled power. It is emotional restraint sharpened into awareness. They no longer argue to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding them. They no longer chase closure from those who created confusion intentionally. Instead, they observe patterns quietly, while everyone else exposes themselves trying to regain emotional access. And the most unsettling part is this: the person who remains calm and silent in moments designed to provoke them is usually a person who understands the situation better than everyone else in the room. Most people are trained to listen to words because words are socially convenient. They sound clean, civilized, believable. But awakened empaths eventually realize something unsettling about human behavior. Words are often designed to manage perception, not reveal truth. Intentions leak somewhere deeper through timing, patterns, hesitation, emotional inconsistency, and behavior repeated under pressure. That's why the awakened empath stops asking, "What did they say?" and starts asking, "What does their behavior keep proving?" Because human beings can rehearse language, but very few can consistently control patterns over time. This changes the way they see everyone. They notice the friend who only reaches out when they need emotional support but disappears when the empath needs the same energy returned. They notice the partner who says, "I care about you," while repeatedly violating boundaries in subtle ways. They notice how certain people suddenly become warm right before making requests, or how respect appears temporarily after distance is created. These details seem invisible to most people because emotional attachment blinds observation. But once the empath becomes emotionally aware instead of only reactive, hidden motives become easier to detect. And this is where it becomes uncomfortable. Because the awakened empath begins realizing how much of human interaction is driven by self-interest disguised as emotion. They start seeing how guilt is used to regain access, how charm is used to lower defenses, how some people apologize only after consequences appear. They observe how insecure individuals often overcompensate with loud confidence, while manipulative people study vulnerabilities before showing affection. Suddenly, conversations feel different. The empath is no longer hypnotized by tone or promises. They watch for congruence, whether actions, timing, energy, and behavior align naturally over time. This creates a psychological advantage few people understand. When you read intentions instead of words, you stop getting trapped by emotional performance. You stop confusing attention with loyalty. You stop mistaking chemistry for safety. And most importantly, you stop explaining away patterns that repeatedly damage your peace. Because patterns are rarely accidents. Human behavior follows emotional incentives. Whatever someone consistently repeats is usually serving him psychologically in ways they may not even consciously understand. You can see panic emerge the moment manipulative people realize the empath is no longer reacting to surface-level language. Suddenly, their tactics lose effectiveness. Excuses stop working. Mixed signals stop creating confusion. Emotional bait loses power. Because once someone sees intention clearly, illusion becomes difficult to maintain. And the awakened empath eventually understands one of the deepest truths about human psychology. People rarely reveal themselves through what they promise in comfortable moments. They reveal themselves through what they repeatedly choose when there is no pressure to be honest. And once you learn to read intentions instead of words, You begin seeing people exactly as they are, long before they realize you already know. Most people misunderstand emotional detachment because they confuse it with coldness, indifference, or the inability to care. But true emotional detachment is something far more dangerous and far more intelligent. It is the moment a person stops allowing emotions to override observation. The awakened empath reaches a point where they finally understand that emotional reactions are often the exact mechanism other people use to gain control. The guilt trips, the sudden withdrawal, the emotional outbursts, the silent treatment. Most human interaction is driven by emotional leverage, and the average person responds automatically without ever realizing they're being psychologically guided. But the awakened empath begins to pause before reacting, and in that pause, power appears. They start noticing how quickly people lose confidence when emotional manipulation stops working. Someone tries to provoke them with disrespect, expecting anger. They remain calm. Someone withdraws affection to trigger anxiety and pursuit. They do not chase. Someone attempts to create guilt to regain control, but instead of instantly apologizing, the empath quietly studies the behavior behind the emotion. That's the shift. Emotional detachment allows them to see patterns clearly because they are no longer drowning inside the feelings those patterns create. This is why emotionally detached people often unsettle others without trying. Most individuals are emotionally predictable. Compliment them and they soften. Ignore them and they panic. Criticize them and they become defensive. But the awakened empath becomes harder to emotionally steer. Their emotional state is no longer easily dictated by external behavior, and human beings become deeply uncomfortable around people they cannot emotionally influence. That discomfort exposes hidden intentions very quickly. The empath also begins realizing something painful about human nature. Many relationships survive not because of mutual respect, but because one person tolerates emotional imbalance longer than they should. The overgiver keeps giving. The peacekeeper keeps apologizing. The empath keeps understanding everyone except themselves. Emotional detachment interrupts this cycle. It forces the empath to ask dangerous questions. Why am I always the one repairing the damage? Why does this person only value me when they fear losing access to me? Why do I feel drained after every interaction? These questions create awareness, and awareness destroys unhealthy emotional attachments faster than conflict ever could. Real emotional power comes from the ability to remain centered while others attempt to pull you into emotional chaos. Because when someone can no longer trigger your fear, guilt, loneliness, ESS, or need for approval, they lose the invisible handle they once used to control you. That's why awakened empaths become quieter over time, more selective, more observant. They stop fighting for connections that require self-betrayal to maintain. And the truth most people never realize is this: the moment you emotionally detach from the need to be chosen, understood, or validated by people who repeatedly disrespect your peace, you become psychologically free in a way that terrifies those who depended on your emotional dependence. Most people don't realize guilt is one of the oldest and most effective forms of psychological control ever created. It doesn't need force. It doesn't need aggression. It works quietly, through emotional pressure, a disappointed tone, a subtle withdrawal, a sentence designed to make someone feel selfish for protecting their own peace. And awakened empaths are often the primary targets because they naturally care deeply about emotional harmony. They feel responsible for tension, discomfort, and the emotions of people around them. Manipulative individuals sense this instinct immediately. They learn that if they can trigger guilt, they can regain influence. But the awakened empath eventually notices a disturbing pattern. Guilt is often used not to communicate pain, but to control behavior. This realization changes everything. They begin observing how some people become upset only when boundaries are enforced. How respect disappears the moment compliance ends. How certain individuals frame accountability as cruelty because they benefited from the empath's lack of limits. The awakened empath starts recognizing the difference between genuine emotional expression and strategic emotional pressure. That distinction is life-changing, because emotionally manipulative people rarely demand control directly. They imply it. They weaponize disappointment. They make the empath feel responsible for emotions they did not create. You can see it happen in ordinary situations. Someone repeatedly crosses boundaries, but the moment the empath distances themselves, the manipulator suddenly becomes emotional. Not reflective, not accountable, emotional. They speak about loyalty, sacrifice, history, or everything they've done for the empath. Why? Because guilt works best when it attacks identity, especially the identity of someone compassionate, the Manny. The manipulator wants the empath to feel like protecting themselves makes them cold, selfish, or ungrateful. And for years, many empaths fall for it because they confuse empathy with emotional self-abandonment. But awakening creates a dangerous psychological shift. The empath stops reacting automatically to emotional pressure. Instead of instantly fixing tension, they pause and study it. They ask themselves questions most people are too emotionally conditioned to ask. Is this person expressing pain or trying to regain control? Why do I only feel guilty when I choose myself? Why does this relationship become unstable the moment I stop overgiving? These questions expose manipulation patterns hidden beneath emotional language. And once the empath sees those patterns clearly, guilt loses its grip. Because guilt only controls people who believe they are responsible for maintaining everyone else's emotional comfort. The awakened empath finally understands that compassion without boundaries becomes a doorway for exploitation. They realize that some people mistake access for entitlement, and the moment that access is restricted, they call it betrayal. That's why awakened empaths become almost impossible to manipulate through guilt. They no longer confuse emotional reactions with moral truth. And the people who once controlled them through shame, disappointment, or emotional pressure suddenly face something they never expected: a person who can feel compassion deeply without surrendering themselves to it. Most people are performing almost all the time. Performing confidence, performing happiness, performing success, dominance, intelligence, kindness, even authenticity. Human behavior is deeply driven by social survival, so people learn early that perception often matters more than truth. They study reactions, adjust personalities depending on the room, and slowly become addicted to approval without realizing it. But the awakened empath eventually sees something disturbing beneath all of this performance. The harder someone tries to appear powerful, the more emotionally dependent they usually are on being perceived that way. Real power rarely needs advertisement. And that realization changes the empath completely. They stop performing emotional availability just to keep people comfortable. Stop forcing laughter to reduce tension. Stop over-explaining themselves to avoid being misunderstood. Stop trying to win rooms through charisma, noise, or constant emotional output. Instead, they become fully present, calm, observant, grounded, and strangely, this unsettles people more than performance ever could, because most human interaction operates like an unconscious emotional negotiation. People are constantly signaling for validation, attention, reassurance, or control. The awakened empath quietly steps outside that system. They no longer need to dominate conversations to feel significant. Their energy becomes more controlled, more selective, and far more difficult to read. This is why true presence feels so rare. Presence cannot be faked for long because it comes from internal stability, not social performance. You can watch this happen in real life. One person enters a room speaking loudly, trying to capture attention instantly. Another says very little but remains emotionally composed, aware, and fully attentive. Over time, people begin gravitating toward the calmer individual. Why? Because human nervous systems constantly scan for certainty and congruence. Deep down, people trust grounded energy more than performed confidence, even if they see. We annotate to explain why. The awakened empath begins understanding that presence carries influence words cannot replicate. Eye contact becomes more intentional. Silence becomes more deliberate. Reactions become slower and more controlled. They realize that emotionally reactive people are easy to manipulate because their behavior is predictable. But presence interrupts predictability. It creates psychological weight. People begin second-guessing themselves around someone who remains centered under pressure because calmness unconsciously signals strength, awareness, and emotional self-possession. And perhaps the most uncomfortable truth is this: many people never actually know who they are because they have spent their entire lives performing versions of themselves designed to gain acceptance. The awakened empath stops doing this. They would rather be misunderstood than emotionally fake. They stop shrinking to fit insecure people. Stop exaggerating to impress empty ones. Stop performing pain to receive sympathy or performing success to receive admiration. Their identity becomes quieter but far more real. And in a world full of people desperate to be noticed, the person who no longer needs ED's attention often becomes the one nobody can stop watching. An awakened empath is not someone who becomes emotionally harder. They become emotionally precise. They stop giving unlimited access to people who only valued their empathy when it was easy to exploit. They stop confusing self-sacrifice with kindness. And once that transformation happens, they become extremely difficult to control. Because the most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest one. It's the person who understands human behavior and no longer needs anyone's approval to remain calm.